I'm Amy Goodman. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. And our guest is Harriet Washington. Harriet Washington is the author of Medical Apartheid. She won a National Book Critics Circle Award in 2007, also the American Library Association Black Caucus Nonfiction Award. She's been a fellow in medical ethics at Harvard Medical School, a senior research scholar at National Center for Bioethics at Tuskegee University, a fellow at the Harvard School of Public Health, and a recipient of a John S. Knight Fellowship at Stanford University. Her latest book is called Deadly Monopolies: The Shocking Corporate Takeover of Life Itself and the Consequences for Your Health and Our Medical Future. Talk about the famous story of Henrietta Lacks. I say famous, but I dare say most people in this country have probably never heard of her.
Right. Well, luckily, fortunately, more people know her now than they had in the mid-'90s when I first learned of her. She was a 31-year-old Baltimore housewife, an African-American housewife who developed uterine cancer and went to Johns Hopkins for treatment. There, she encountered George Guy, who was a physician who was bent on creating cell lines and was looking for a very long-lived cell line. A cell line is a community of cells that is very, very useful for medical research. On it, you can safely test many medications and procedures instead of using a human being. So he was looking for cells that would live a long time, but the cells would die very quickly. They took cells from Henrietta Lacks, and they never died. They continued to divide.
Now, explain again who Henrietta was.
Henrietta Lacks was a 31-year-old black Baltimore housewife whose cells had an unusual property. They're called immortal, and they have been living for 60 years now. So when George Guy found her cells, it was a gold mine for him. It's exactly what he'd been looking for. And with her cells, the cell line coming from it, there were numerous medical advances. I spoke with Dr. Victor McCusick of Johns Hopkins before he passed away, and he told me that when I asked him how many advances were these cells responsible for, he said, in the aggregate, they're too numerous to count. But one really important advance was a polio vaccine. It could not have been perfected without the HeLa cells. So her cells were...
Henrietta Lacks.
Henrietta Lacks, So the H-E-L-A, right. So cells are immensely important for American medicine, and yet Henrietta Lacks herself had died without ever knowing her cells had been taken. Her husband had refused permission to take the cells, but Dr. Guy took them anyway. And her children and family had no idea that she was this important benefactor to American medicine. Doctors would descend on her family, the Lacks family, periodically, just as with John Moore, looking for more tissues, for more blood. But they told the family, we want to make sure that you don't have the same cancer your mother died from. Essentially the same lie that John Moore had been told. Really, they were using the cells and tissues to make very important scientific tests. So that was Henrietta Lacks.
That story was also made famous by Rebecca Skloot, who wrote The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks.
Yes, Rebecca's a friend of mine, I'm proud to say. We're in the same writing group, and it's a wonderful book, and it's a wonderful thing Rebecca has done, making Henrietta's story known to so many people.
So Henrietta Lacks' cell line has been so critical for so much research.
Yes.
What about how much money it has made?
No one wants to talk about that. Typically, when I talk to researchers about that, they said, oh, well, it was never bought and sold, but it was. It was bought and sold for like $200 per sample, but it was never patented. Because it wasn't patented, it could be sold for these low fees, nominal fees. But we have to remember that there were thousands, maybe a billion transactions. So nobody will give an accounting, but it certainly generated a lot of money just from the sale of the cells. And then the advances themselves, who can put a price on the polio vaccine? So they are priceless, literally.
Yet her family, many members, could not even afford health insurance.
However, when I talked to her family many times in the 90s, the money did not concern them as much as the fact that they knew that their mother was a medical benefactor and she'd never gotten her due. People didn't know about her, didn't know about this.
Harriet Washington, talk about the price of drugs.
Well, the pharmaceutical industry doesn't deny that it charges high prices for our drugs. And of course, it can't deny that. We all know this, although insurance hides the true cost from a lot of us. But what it says is that we have to charge high prices because it costs from $800 million to $2 billion to develop every new drug. So we have to charge high prices to recoup our research and development costs, and also to make sure that the money is there for the next development, the next innovation. Well, that's not true. There are many, many flaws and outright falsehoods feeding this argument. I did a thorough analysis in the book with the help of really good work by Meryl Guzner, an economist. And basically, what they did was they only looked at not a wide spectrum of our drugs in making this, this figure. They looked at a very narrow swathe of drugs that are extraordinarily rare and expensive. So if they had looked at the more narrow swathe of drugs, they would have come up with a figure like $100 million. As Meryl Guzner said, it's not chump change, but it's not $800 million either. It's not $2 billion. Also, a lot of the innovation is fueled by government support of research. And who pays for government support of research? You and I do with our tax dollars. So it's almost entirely a fiction. And this this claim that drugs cost so much to develop is only a rationale for them being able to charge high prices. The real reason our drugs cost so much is because our government allows these companies to charge what Americans are able and willing to pay to stay alive. It's no accident that the most expensive drugs are for the most serious diseases.
Earlier this month, the American Civil Liberties Union announced it would ask the Supreme Court to rule on a patent by Myriad Genetics, a company based in Utah that deals with gene analysis. The long-standing and controversial case has been moving up from the lower court since 2009 when it was first filed. The case involves patents on 2 genes that can have mutations linked to breast, ovarian, and prostate cancers. I want to play a clip of the CEO of the company who's patented the genes, Peter Meldrum of Myriad Genetics. In a 2010 interview, he explained his position on the ACLU case.
The ACLU believes very strongly that the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office should not grant patents to companies like Myriad Genetics on genes. Genes are a product of nature. Myriad didn't invent the gene. We didn't create the gene. But we did discover what the gene did and how you could use that medically to benefit patients. There's a lot of case law, including a U.S. Supreme Court case, that's upheld the patenting of genes. And in fact, the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office has granted over 3,000 gene patents to numerous companies. The ACLU, though, disagrees with that. And so they have filed a lawsuit against Myriad to try to overturn gene patents. Myriad is going to defend that lawsuit very aggressively.
That's Peter Meldrum, the CEO of Myriad Genetics. In the same interview, he explains the market potential of hereditary breast cancer research.
There are about 156 million women in the United States, and according to published studies, about 4% of those have an appropriate family history such that they would be at risk for hereditary breast cancer testing. So that represents about 6.5 million women in the United States. Obviously, it will take us time to penetrate that market, but the BioColonialism test, which sells for $3,120, that represents almost a $20 billion market value for that segment. It is a prevalence market. It's not an incidence market. So you have to make an assumption as to how quickly we can penetrate that market. We believe we can penetrate that market in 30 years or under. And so dividing 20 million by 30 years gives us over a $600 million annual market opportunity for just the BioColonialism product alone.
That's Peter Meldrum, CEO of Myriad Genetics. Explain what Mr. Meldrum is referring to.
He's talking about the fact that Myriad, a private corporation, holds 7 patents on the genes associated with high familial risk of breast cancer. This is exactly the sort of problem that we're facing today. A corporation owns the patent. And what does that mean? It means not only can it do whatever it wants with this gene, it can prevent other people from working with it. In Paris, for example, a French researcher at the Curie Institute found that this particular test, the tests of Myriad, actually miss a lot of breast cancers. But that finding could never have been made here in this country because when other people try to work with these genes, Myriad sends a cease and desist letter and tells them, we have the patent on this, you cannot work with it. So it's clear that the research into breast cancer treatment is being stymied by this patent. And Myriad is concerned with, as you heard, collecting its $3,000 to $4,000 fees from each woman who gets a BRCA analysis. I think it's nothing short of criminal.
Talk further about what this means for medical research in the United States and the privatization, the corporatization of knowledge.
Right. The ability of a corporation to hold a patent on our gene. The legal rationale for it is that they hold patents on genes that have been purified and isolated, so that they're not the same genes in our body. But they are the same genes in our body. I think this is just a... Judge Sweet, who made a ruling on this, called it a lawyer's trick. I call it just semantics.
Talk about Judge Sweet's role in all.
Well, Judge Sweet, a little over a year ago, invalidated the patents. He said that these patents are not defensible, that you can't patent a product of nature, and they weren't valid. So for about a year, the patent was in effect, but of course it was reversed on appeal. And so now Myriad still holds a patent, as many other corporations hold patents on many genes, and the final decision will be made at the Supreme Court. It's going to be going to the Supreme Court. I'm not sure when, but probably not before too long.
Talk about the drug Makena.
Makena, it's fascinating. Women who are pregnant and who are at risk for premature delivery, for a long time could go to a compounding pharmacy and get a drug called Krypton-C 17P. 17P is what it was called, only at a number, not a name. It cost $10 to $30, and it was thought to be very effective at preventing the early delivery, which of course is linked to a host of problems with children. Then, under the Orphan Drug Act, that's what I found fascinating, a private corporation, KV Pharmaceuticals, got FDA approval to test it and to patent it. Now this, you know...
Explain what the Orphan Drug Act is.
The Orphan Drug Act was intended to give incentive to corporations to test and patent and market drugs that for diseases that affected less than 200,000 people. They normally wouldn't be profitable enough for a company to be interested, but the FDA said, under this act, we'll give you 7 years of patent exclusivity so that you can make some money, and also you'll be addressing a need by a minority of Americans. Sounds really great. It is really great, actually, on the surface, but this kind of use I find really unfortunate. So KV Pharmaceuticals used that act to patent Makena. Now it sells the exact same drug, 17P, but it doesn't cost $30. It costs $30,000 for a course of the drug. So it raised the price very high, and it not only, it then went a step further. It sent letters to the compounding pharmacies warning them they had to stop making the drug because KV held the patent, and if they kept making the cheap version of the drug, the FDA would shut them down. There was such a hue and cry over this that several weeks later, maybe even a month later, the FDA stepped in and said, in this unique circumstance, we are not going to shut down the compounding pharmacies. You can still get a cheap version of the drug. But that's no guarantee. We don't know how long this will last. And it only happened after a month of outcry.
But explain how it works where a generic is challenged.
Well, the generic drug is the same drug. It was available cheaply. When a private company is able to get a patent on that drug and immediately raises the price, it typically can force a generic drug to stop being manufactured, as KV tried to do. Typically, it'd be able to do that. And now American women who used to be able to afford a whole course of the drug for $400, almost everyone can afford that. Now it costs $30,000, and women without insurance might not have access to it. So it can be, you know, it can be devastating. It can mean giving birth to a child who's got a lifetime of illness as opposed to a healthy child.
Harriet Washington, you have a chapter called BioColonialism. Explain what you mean.
Well, I'm talking about the fact that the same colonial mentality that led to the appropriation of the lands and the minerals and jewels and animals of developing world now leads to the appropriation of their bodies, their tissues, and their plants. And we have, for example, private corporations took a patent out on neem, a very ancient Indian drug, used, you know, globally, used widely, and suddenly American corporation has a patent on it, and in theory could stop the Indian healers and villagers and companies from using it. The patent was later invalidated, but it shows a sort of mentality that you know, the developed world has toward the riches of the developing world.
Give more specific examples about biocolonialism.
Well, let's see, there are so many. I would say that one really good example is what happened in Tristan da Cunha. It's an isolated island off the coast of South Africa, and American researchers went there and told them, you don't have any health care here, you have one doctor. We are going to examine your health situation and see what kind of help we can give you. You have high rates of asthma, we're going to look into that. They gave them some old antiquated asthma equipment, but they left with biological samples, tissues, blood, etc., that when they got back to America, they mined for valuable properties, and also they were looking for high prevalence of other diseases. They were looking for high prevalence of stigmatizing diseases like schizophrenia. They did the same thing with Havasupai Indians in the Grand Canyon in this country. So instead of, they told the people one thing, and with a total lack of transparency, they were looking for medically valuable tissues and body parts, and found them.
And how do people have any control when their cell line is patented?
They have no control. They can sue, but the courts have been dismayingly consistent in denying the rights to their own tissues from their own bodies, genes from their own bodies, to people who sue. Typically, when such a suit takes place, there is a flurry of amicus curiae briefs, friend of the court briefs filed by medical institutions, private corporations, pharmaceutical corporations, and they all say to the courts, if you let this person invalidate our patent, then you're going to be setting medical research behind. And the courts have been very much swayed by that argument.
Talk about Rosie Periwinkle.
Well, that's one of the many, many drugs that was found in the developing world and turned into a medication, for example, against prostate cancer. So when explorers and naturalists go to the developing world and the shamans there show them these medicines, the explorers don't tell them, I'm going to take this medicine back to my country and get a patent on it, and now I have control over it, even among your people if I choose. And that's exactly what happened with Rosie Periwinkle and many other drugs.
Ayahuasca?
Yeah, yage is what it's more popularly called. It's this very interesting hallucinogenic herb that's captured the imagination of Americans and Europeans for a very long time. And they have gone to Brazil and they have had indigenous people show them how to use it. But one U.S. researcher, Lauren Miller, I believe his name was, he took a sample back with him and got a patent on it. And with this patent, he informed the people in the developing world that I now control this. It led to a flurry of court cases, which he eventually won. So you had an American with a patent on yage, a drug that had been used for centuries by the people of the developing world.
It's called yage by the indigenous people of Amazon who revere it, and by William S. Burroughs and Allen Ginsberg, who immortalized it in the yage
and
letters.
Sting, who also liked it. So as I said, I've captured the imagination of Europeans and Americans for a very long time, and it's doubtless very useful as a psychoactive drug. And now, I think the patent that Lauren Miller had, the U.S. researcher had, has expired. So it's no longer controlled by us, but that could change at any moment, and it's going to happen with the next drug.
Harriet,
I mean, there's always another yage.
Talk about what WTO and TRIPS have to do with this.
The World Trade Organization. TRIPS is trade-related intellectual property, and basically what they did was it forced the people of the developing world, countries like Nigeria, Brazil, Thailand, poor countries with very little medical care, it forces them to recognize the patents of Europe and America. These countries used to get access to pharmaceuticals because India was a source of cheap drugs. India would take European drugs, reverse engineer them, and then market them cheaply to the developing world so that people in South Africa and Thailand could also get important life-saving drugs. But TRIPS has made this impossible. Now Indian factories can't do it because they would be violating the patent, which they're forced to respect. Fortunately, the people of the developing world, the countries got together, and they went to Doha, Qatar, and had a meeting there, sanctioned by the WTO, and they won one very important concession. That is They have march-in rights. March-in rights are those rights given every government to invalidate a corporation's patent. So if you have a company, for example, that has a patent for a life-saving drug, but it won't make that drug, then the government has the right to commandeer it and give it to somebody who will make it cheaply. And that's exactly what Brazil did. And that's exactly what Thailand did. They told American companies, you're charging too much for your antiretrovirals. We have people with AIDS here who need them, and we are going to take control of your drug and give it to a company here to make it cheaply. Americans were very unhappy about that. The Secretary of Commerce was very angry. We made lots of pronouncements about the theft of intellectual property, which is almost ironic if you think of the history of biocolonialism. But the people in the developing world have stood firm. So I think, there's a glimmer of hope now because they are simply refusing to accept these unfair TRIPS restrictions. I want to talk about Haiti as well and talk about the laboratory of the West. We're speaking with Harriet Washington. We're going to go to break and come back. She's a medical ethicist. Her latest book is called Deadly Monopolies, the shocking corporate takeover of life itself and the consequences for your health and our medical future. Stay with us.